Are we going to keep fighting when we are in heaven? I think we should peace. We should find love. We should find tolerance. We should find understanding.
Who will protect our children when the streets continue to prove untrustworthy of the talents behind their smiles? When it's no longer safe for your child to play in the front yard gated by the homes of safe haven because they were behaving so suspiciously. Suspected water guns used to get us through that police's heat, but no competition for the police's heat. I thought that was my taser. Gunned down innocently, and he hasn't even met his teams. The system systematically set up for my downfall, all because my skin has been penetrated by the sun's core. Absorbed tears from 400 years, kissed with the graces of titanium, but even the strongest gets weak. Seeking understanding for my legacies, on bending knees for my seeds, hearing other mothers crying, Lord, please, not my baby. And no matter if she's 25 or 80, that's somebody's baby, and that anguish never goes away. When did the war on terror become the home of terror? Terrorized only by my demographics I was born with. Hands up, don't shoot, it's only candy and juice. It's my baby's birthday, I'm only carrying some shoes. Or questions of what did I even do can get you judge and jury on the side of the street, convicted without a trial's confusion, guilty by association, punishable by death while the system continues to help. You see, freedom ain't free, but ask me when it didn't come at a high cost to be black in America, home of the free test rats of Tuskegee, Tulsa, Oklahoma bombings, alligator-baited babies, every innocent man killed at the hands of the police since the 70s. And if I'm not mistaken, we didn't get our equal rights until the mid-60s when we stopped working for free and demanded the right to just be. Live like human beings, still threatened in the night by the day teachers, store clerks and the police, those strange fruits hunting children walking 5 miles just for an education that never educated our youth. How can you expect us to maintain a nonviolent spirit in a violent atmosphere designed to tear us down and brutally murder us on the streets like rabid animals? Caged us like birds with clipped wings and expected us not to fly, laws to openly carry a bull's eye on our backs, and I'll ask again, who is going to protect our babies? Who is going to show proof that we all stand together for us all? Who is going to stand beside me? Well, when?
I just really want to thank all of you for taking the time out to participate in this conversation. I feel like it's really, really needed. So thank you for your time and your willingness to contribute your voice and your knowledge, your expertise. What are your thoughts on the coverage surrounding the murder of George Floyd? Do you feel like the coverage was done well, or were there things that you felt like were done very poorly?
I'll say this. I think the coverage is better than the coverage was with Jamar Clark and with Philando Castile, which were two of the previous police killings here in the Twin Cities. With that being said, there's still a lot that was missed by some of the major media outlets and some that even some of the local outlets we're having a hard time grasping. At the end of the day, I was so busy being a Black man living in North Minneapolis, dealing with the fact that we had white supremacists at our doorstep, that it was hard for me as a journalist to cover the fact that we have white supremacists in our midst who were using this as an opportunity to capitalize on the grief and pain that we as Black people were experiencing due to the death of George Floyd. So that's one of the areas where, in terms of a long-term report, that's something that I'm planning on revisiting, because it's the part of the story that's not being told, that's been glossed over, and has in some ways just been left out.
I think I'm going to be a little cynical. And George, I want to thank you for putting this together. And I really, really wish I could be there with my fellow Minnesotans. but being so far away, I think my honing in on the coverage really showed a difference between national coverage and local coverage. And I think in part it is because of a decade of newsrooms cutting back and retiring many African-American reporters and broadcasters, many who had come up through these newsrooms and started to make good livings. And as the recession came around 2010, they started targeting those people and offering them early retirement. And you saw the decimation of the newsroom in terms of being able to cover stories in communities of color by people of color, and slowly started to become more and more white. It also became less and less of a newsrooms with depth, because as the older ones were weaned out, they started hiring more and more people who could do the job, but they were not being trained in the job. They had no background in the community. So you see more and more people going out to cover these instances where they did not have any depth. There was no follow. The shame of the 24-hour news clock is that there is no follow-up. There is no background. And now you don't have any newsrooms with depth. I watched the national news, which was outstanding. I think watching reporters of color get in there and really letting people see through the power of video what we have known for our entire lives.
And I think that the other thing that national news did so well was that they jumped right to the why of it, where local news was stuck on the what from a lot of the coverage that I saw. I'm in LA, so it was mostly just what are they doing? Oh, they're looting and they're rioting, and they weren't talking to the community about why. And okay, the unemployment rate is twice as high for blacks than it is for whites, whether we were in COVID or not. And more blacks are dying from COVID-19 than whites. And like going into all of this frustration, the national news did a great job, I think, of going into the why early and not focusing on just what they were doing.
And I have to take my hat off to Unicorn Riot and the alternative media for really doing a hell of a job of really showing people what's going on. If it wasn't for 9 seconds of video, none of this would be shaking the world today. That's the power of video.
Ditto to everything everyone has mentioned, and I would add, I do still think media has a problem with sort of acknowledging our expertise and our lived experience as sort of a primary expert in areas. We're still being viewed as biased because of our lived experience versus being viewed as experts because of our lived experience. And I think that's still a challenge.
I heard of one reporter, and I can't remember exactly the city that she was in, but was told she would not be able to cover any of the Floyd protests. We're always being silenced in newsrooms. That's nothing new. That's several decades old. Being told that we can't be objective on stories. And you have to work really hard to get around that and get what you need on the air or in print, because there will always be somebody who will doubt what you're saying, doubt that you could be objective, doubt that you can actually, in many cases, turn a story that is well done. So we have a lot more work to do.
Yeah, but with this one, as a journalist, absolutely, we are supposed to be objective. With this particular story, what's the other side? I mean, we literally watched a man for 8 minutes and 46 seconds being killed. So there isn't another side to this one. And so I was on a forum yesterday and they were asking what made this one different. And my answer was, first, when you talk about Jamar Clark, there were eyewitnesses and there was video that we weren't shown until months after when Mike Freeman decided that he was going to acquit Dustin Ringenberger and Mark Swartzy, who killed Jamar Clark. So there was this reasonable doubt. When Philando was killed, you saw immediately after he was shot, and you saw him dying on camera but you didn't see what led up to it. And there was still this reasonable doubt. What was different with this one was we saw the killing take place. 8 minutes, 46 seconds. There is no doubt. There is no reasonable doubt at all in this one. And you take into effect that we have COVID-19. And before, when other people, these other heinous acts were taking place, we had a distraction. Well, that distraction was removed because we didn't have a basketball game to turn to. We didn't have a football game. We couldn't go to the club. So we had to actually just continue to engage in this one act. And once we finally sat down and engaged, we said, we can't stand for this as a people. And by as a people, I'm saying humans.
I want to switch gears a little bit. And so I'm wondering if you all can share, if you have personally felt in your professional experience in media that your experience as a professional of color in media has been different than your white counterparts. And if so, how?
With Tom Lydon, where I would tell him the story I was going to go into the staff meeting and pitch, and have him repeat the same story and see what happened. And I would pitch the story and I would either get, we've done that, or we don't have time for that. And then we move around the table and Tom will go, I have an idea. Tom, that's a great idea. And we go out and drink later and go, can you believe that? Blank. You know, but it happened all the time, whether it was my time management, my professional appearance, what I did outside of work, what stories I covered, it was always held to a different standard. The difference for many other people that get frustrated with that and leave, quit, go to another station, was that I carried the majority of the ratings at that station. So they could mess with me, but to a point. Because if I left, I took all my numbers with me and the majority of the community. And that really meant because I knew that there were disparities, I knew from the start, the first thing that I was taught when I got into the business by people that were really wise was that if you have the community, then you have support, they won't mess with you. And I made it my agenda to go out and be in the community. And back at one point when the station actually had FCC regulations, they would come to me to fulfill the station's FCC requirements because they knew I did at least 5 to 7 engagements a month. And they didn't feel any need to do it themselves. Our black anchor will do it. But they still felt compelled to mess with me on a regular basis on ridiculous things.
For me, it was kind of on 3 different levels. For one, I was a producer in a few different newsrooms, and I went through the same thing as you, Ms. Robinson, about how I wanted to pitch certain stories, and if somebody else pitched it, it somehow was a better idea. But also, I was a manager, assistant news director and news director at news stations, and I had to battle it out with my fellow managers on even, we had a case in where was I, Oklahoma then, where there was a white cop killed a black man, and they did not want to say colors in the report at all. And so here I am as a manager having to tell them why we need to, and this is actually around, I want to say it was around the time of the Philando incident. So this is going on in America, and why do I have to fight to put this in the newscast to say a color? It was a white officer that killed an unarmed black man, and that's what it was. And we had to fight to just put race into it. So fighting with my fellow managers, I've had to do that. And then here in California, I work for the military government public affairs, and I have to fight to get information out because now it's more of a PR side of things that I'm on. And my coworkers, we have a pretty diverse actual office, but my coworkers who are our counterparts and white, they don't understand the looting and things like that. So I'm explaining that, but also our leaders, it's all about looking good. So me writing up things for them to say about how the military is diverse, but also having to put in there, well, still only 8% of of officers in the military are Black. Only, actually, it's a little less than 8. My husband's one of them, and so everywhere we go we're the only ones here. So it's trying to explain this needs to be in your statement as well. You can't say everything is fine and dandy in the military. So because we know there's issues, look at the numbers. So I've experienced it on maybe 3 different levels, but it's definitely a different situation for me versus my counterpart.
I think the other aspect of this that's been interesting to see is the ability for a media person to go into, a field situation and come out with some real quality understanding of the story, right? We see the value of somebody who is, like Robin mentioned, who is connected to community. You can go to those communities, you can have an actual conversation and come up with a real story behind what is happening, versus if you have to go in there as a media person and you need protection from the community and you need all of these other added elements, you're never going to get very close to the actual story. So those are relationships that are developed well before something actually, jumps off like this.
DA, I think the only reason that I wound up getting the stories that I got at Channel 9 is because one day a reporter said he wasn't going on into Near North. He refused. And from that day forward, I made it my mission to go into neighborhoods and talk to people when they really didn't want to talk to the media. I mean, I started just months before Tysel Nelson was shot and killed by Minneapolis police officers. So I was there to see it all and watch them put media people out of group meetings at North High School. And I said to myself, if my station's not going to want to cover this, I have to cover this, and I have to be in the community. We were the only station that were allowed into gang summits. We were the only station that were allowed to follow in the LBGT community because when there was a gay serial killer happening in Minneapolis, because people like me and other people around the country feel the need to go in there and actually be a part of it. There's a very cosmetic part of media that people are just using it to get to the next step. But there are really genuine people who want to be involved, but there is a barrier between the community and the reporters on actually knowing how to talk to each other. And then there's a barrier between the community and management on how to force those stories to be on the air.
For me, it was a little bit different because I came from 10 years being in the Black press. So before I was at North News, I was with Insight News. And so obviously these are the stories that I was telling, and my newsroom experience is much different. But early on in my reporting career in St. Louis, when I was covering Jennings, it was so bad. And at the time I drove a beat up 1988 Toyota Celica. When I would go into Jennings, I would call the police department beforehand, say, this is who I am. This is my car. I'm coming to cover a school board meeting. Please don't pull me over. So those were my experiences. And then even with Philando, I had an experience where a police officer was threatening to arrest me because I pulled up on a scene where they were attempting to either arrest and or harass, I don't know, some Black men. And I had my camera out filming it. And I'm showing them I have my press lanyards on my dashboard and everything. And they're still threatening to arrest me. So when the brother from CNN got arrested, I was like, yeah, that happens.
Mm-hmm. I feel like the tone and temperament from when I would be on the street covering things, dealing with the MPD, Bob Kroll, all the myriad of police officers and police captains, there was a different attitude. It's become militaristic. It's become hostile. They have more protection from their unions than ever before. Most of the city money goes to dealing with MPD, and a lot of it is to solve a lot of the brutality cases that they've gone through. It was frightening to me, actually, to see so many of the same familiar faces with the MPD that are still there and still in control. I think I saw Mike Sorrow at a Trump rally with the police union. It frightened me. But it didn't surprise me. It just says, that there's a real problem with the change in attitude on how the police have what they've materialized into, and it is completely militaristic and weaponized against its own people. And that's the difference between when I was on the street and then Harry being on the street, and that frightens me for you and UPA more than it does anything else I can possibly think of.
To be very honest, it's just very daunting. When you talk about seeing George Floyd, Philando Castile, Jamar Clark, and Sandra Bland, and Breonna Taylor, and you keep naming names and names and names and names, Tamir Rice, and you go on and on. I keep the name I keep coming up with Harry Colbert. Each time I recognize how that could have been me. And so that's what I'm trying to reconcile and deal with, and still be the objective journalist telling this story. But it also fuels me and motivates me to let me know that that's exactly why I'm here, because I'm supposed to be here telling this story.
In terms of Minneapolis media, Twin Cities media, it was a little challenging for me to come back to Minnesota after, working as a journalist in Columbus, Georgia, where there's a lot more diversity. At least there was at the station I worked at. And so to come home and know that the actual population here in the Twin Cities is very, very diverse. We have one of the largest Somali populations. We have a large, Hispanic population, a large Hmong population, but none of that is really reflected in our media. And I think that it definitely does kind of tilt stories a little bit. And so that's my own personal opinion and experience. And so I'm curious to know from you all who have worked in this market, what your thoughts are on the diversity or lack thereof here in the Twin Cities media, and how that impacts coverage.
It impacts it in a major way. I mean, you have people that refuse to go into neighborhoods and do stories. You have news organizations that worry really a lot more about their equipment than they do about their people. And so you're not getting fair and balanced coverage. Every news organization has its own slant. So, you have to take that into a grain of salt. But you're doing a disservice to the community because you have all those things that I mentioned before that play in a newsroom, and no one really taking the time to teach people. One of the one things that I insisted upon was when news reporters came into the newsroom, that they were given a map of the Twin Cities with all the community names on them. Because it is decidedly racist to just name some neighborhood North Minneapolis and South Minneapolis. If people know the neighborhoods, then they have a good idea what's happening, where, and what is their level of involvement or non-involvement. But it paints a racist brush that goes far beyond what's happening just on the screen. It affects real estate. People get zoned. They refuse to move into neighborhoods, and then the economic blight drops. There is so much that needs to be done, aside from blowing it up and starting all over again. The media now is in a really critical stage, not just in the local newsrooms, but media all across the world. For the first time, the United States is listed on one of the worst places for journalists to work. And I think in part it happened because of the George Floyd protest. When you see people getting shot in the eye, or their leg is bruised up from thigh all the way down to their ankle. It's a dangerous atmosphere out there, not from the people who are on the street necessarily, although you have to worry about that, but you have to worry about law enforcement as well now. And it makes it a really dangerous thing when the president enacts decades-old tropes against the media that were used not only in the 19th century, but also by the Nazis. When they start saying that the media is lying and fake news, that goes back to World War II and the Nazis and Lügenpresse, what they call lying media. And when you whip people up on that frenzy, it makes it incredibly dangerous to do your job out there. And so I do worry about journalists today, and I worry about Harry and DA and everybody who is out there on the street, because it's a new atmosphere out there. It's changed out there, and we have to really do something to protect our journalists.
Our reporter was out there, and David, and he actually got hit with a tear. This was day 2 of the uprising, and he got hit in the leg with a tear gas canister. He said his leg still hurts, but that wasn't the worst part. It was the actual deployment of the tear gas, and he suffers from asthma as well, so you can only imagine.
Black reporters are at a greater risk than their white counterparts because of the health and the mental health and the physical health of what's happening right now across the nation. And we need to protect them now more than ever, and support them more than ever. Even though I was here in California, I was getting calls and talking to people where I was sending messages to Reg Chapman, sending messages to Maury Glover, talking to photographers, making sure that they knew what was happening, even if I wasn't there. We have to make sure that we protect them, inform them, and make sure that they have a voice in the community. That's what's missing.
The mental health is huge. Harry, you spoke about it as well. It's just, I've actually been on with the Society of Professional Journalists and the San Diego Association of Black Journalists on different Zoom calls and helping them organize different ways to bring journalists together to take that mental break, to find out how can I cope through this, because we were already going through some things with the pandemic, of course, and having to do our jobs in an entirely different way and have all this new equipment at our home, possibly to do different newscasts and things like that and interviews. So you were already going through that, and now you're going through this, and you were already Black. So you were already going through some other things even before these 2 pandemics, I'll call them. So there's different things that we have been just suggesting to the newsroom managers of even during a crisis and when you're not together, you're doing Zoom or webinars, how can you take breaks and connect still and communicate well with your team to make sure you have those mental health breaks, because they're needed? And how can you recognize it? And how can you make sure that, how do you go to your boss in the news and say, I know I'm on this big story, but I need a day or two. It's tough, but we need to do it. And so, that's the first thing I say is just make sure you're please adhering to your health, your mental health, your physical health, because it comes first. And then just one more point was just with Harry talked about just uniting with your colleagues who are there with you, because when Omar got arrested, he works for CNN, but you had MSNBC, you had all these other NPR, all these other organizations who made statements, who voiced their concerns about his arrest. There were people who spoke out to the police who didn't work for CNN. So it comes as you need that united voice. So make sure that we're sticking together as journalists and then taking care of our health.
From the local standpoint, I think Black journalists especially have to navigate a kind of a nuanced position here, because we're in a generally liberal market, and that's acknowledged. Yet, so it's harder to talk about some of the nuanced reasons why, Minneapolis and the Twin Cities and Minnesota at large could be one of the more racist places, or one of the more, sort of institutional white supremacist places, because they have a self-interest in promoting this image of being inclusive and this image of being diverse. And they're there to celebrate Prince. And, there's a lot of elements to it that would make, if you didn't know this place, would make this look like this utopia. Whereas if you talk to Black folks and their lived experience, they know the difference. They know why we have all of these gaps, gaps that have been persistent through 30, 40, 50 years, and everywhere from economics and housing to education. And no form of liberalism, no form of nonprofit organizations, no form of that whole structure has been able to cut into that. And there's a reason for it. And it's because, again, there's a way for this to be this place to be, have the image of being a utopia, yet still perpetrating this systemic issue. So as Black journalists, as Black storytellers, I think we support each other and really elevate each other and amplify each other when we're trying to tell those really subtle stories. Because the media at large, they don't get those subtle stories. They don't get that subtle understanding. So, we definitely have to make sure we're supportive of one another and amplifying those local, sometimes more marginal voices and bringing those to the forefront.
Well, to go ahead and wrap things up, I want to leave off on a positive note. And so I'm wondering if you all can offer a little insight on what changes that you all think need to happen in order to improve mainstream media coverage on stories of Black and brown people.
Put more Black and brown people in power positions, period. That's the bottom line. We need more Black and brown people who are decision makers. As Robin said earlier, a lot of glamour goes with being the face, but sometimes you're just at the face. You don't have the power to do what you really want to do.
I agree, Harry. I think also it is imperative that newsroom management know that they have all eyes on them now. And so they have to make sure that if you don't have people of color in every aspect of your production, if it's not an assistant news director, a producer, executive producer, chief of photographer, senior anchor, senior reporter, if you don't have a full contingency, you must insist that the people who work at your station know the community, are out in the community, that they are asked on a regular basis, what have they contributed to the community in staff meetings and in individual meetings? Because this is the only way that things are going to change. You can't have one newsroom that has half of the people in the community and the other half are afraid to even go talk to people in the community. If they are not willing to take those steps to do fair and unbiased news, then they need to seek another type of employment.
And it's about also in management, making sure no matter who you have in management, yes, prefer to be a Black person, someone of color, but also making sure they're holding their reporters, their producers, and their staff accountable, making sure that their stories aren't just scratching the surface, that you're digging deep. And you know what, if this is going to miss time slot, if this needs more time, I know that's like unheard of in news, but we got to do it because this needs more. This is not acceptable for air. So I think, as you mentioned as well, just holding them accountable, having those people in position that can make change, and making sure if you don't have those people in position that at least they recognize what's going on. I mean, when I was working in Columbus, Georgia, I don't know if you were there at that time, but when Michael Brown was killed, it happens overnight. This is big news overnight. I go into the morning, I turn on the morning news at 5 a.m. after hardly sleeping at all, after watching that. And I noticed, even though we had a Black anchor, we had a Black producer, they did not lead or have anything about Michael Brown's death in that first block. And it drove me crazy. And I didn't understand it. And so here you can have Black people in that position and still not understand the importance of something. So just making sure that people are aware and held accountable in their positions.
I'd also like to see more activism among Twin Cities Black journalists. And I'm not being critical of the wonderful organization, but it was something that I always believed that the organization needs to really be able to meet quarterly with news directors and the head of newspaper organizations to ask them what they have been doing, to really pay attention to the stories that are being written and be able to call them on the subtleties. And so they know that somebody is watching them and that they have to do better as well.
Yeah, I would say lastly, just, push these editorial boards, push some of these decision makers around, how stories are curated and make sure that we're well represented in those. Like the Star Tribune's editorial board right now, there's no representation for any people of color. I think maybe perhaps one, but that's a great absence. And then the other thing I would say is, I think it's ironic that a lot of people are being introduced to Ida B. Wells as a journalist and an activist and an abolitionist, and she held all of those intersections at once and was high quality and was a beacon of light in the community, but also was telling a critical story that couldn't come from any place else. And so, the journalism at large likes to to marginalize a voice like Ida B. Wells in the past and just consider her strictly an activist when she was one of the foremost journalists of her time. So we could look at this time and say the same thing about those voices that are out there that are very strong and very opinionated, yet they are giving you facts. They are giving you the untarnished sort of part of unbiased, which is just some really raw truths. I've been interested in seeing how the media at large, their coverage has changed around policing when they're the ones being hit with rubber bullets, right? Because that's a real life experience that you cannot recover from. You can't come back from that and say, all right, I have to figure out an unbiased way to tell this story. You have to tell the story exactly how it existed, which, you got pushed by a violent force for doing your job. And then also watching them sort of put the First Amendment back together, because the First Amendment is not bifurcated, right? It's the right of the media and the right to tell stories, and it's also the right to protest. They're together in the First Amendment for a reason. And there is no shame in us representing as the right to protest and the right to redress, and also the right to tell a story and the freedom of the press. Those are connected for a reason.
Amen.
And it's sad to say, but it's the truth. And going back to what DA was saying earlier, once you have these other journalists, a lot of white journalists who are now experiencing what we've been telling them for years, well, now the narrative starts to shift a little bit. Well, maybe there's a nugget of truth. They still won't give us the whole truth, but now they're saying, oh, there's a nugget of truth to what you're saying.
All right. Well, I want to thank you all for taking the time today. I want to be respectful of time. I know a few of you have to check out. So thank you all for taking the time to participate in this conversation. I'm very thankful that we're able to come together and have this conversation. It brings joy to my heart because I hold each one of you in high esteem. But it saddens me that it's under these circumstances. So please keep the lines of communication open. And if there's any ways that I can support what you all are doing, I'm here for that.
I am George Floyd.
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 My life matters.
My life matters.
My life matters. My life matters.
My life matters.
My life matters.
Justice to me is doing what's right.
When somebody commits a crime,
they get locked up.
It's equal accountability for all.
Justice to me is fixing inequality.
And justice to me is equality across the board.
It's ironic that black men are often targeted by white officers.
I'm still facing things that my parents have faced over the years.
I think it's not fair because I think everybody should be equal. And I think that everybody should, go to the same things. Everybody should have the same opportunities.
I've noticed that justice does not have the face of color as much as it used to. I really think that the face of justice is green these days, and the lower class suffers on a regular basis.
Justice to me is seeing those who bring our black community down by abusing their power behind bars.
The person who committed a crime,
they will have to suffer consequences.
Justice to me is when a black man in general, just a black man in general, walks down the street. I feel like he shouldn't be threatened when he sees a cop or a cop car, or he shouldn't feel like his life is in danger when he sees someone wearing that badge, because the person wearing that badge has or feels like they have more power than they actually do, and they abuse that power.
Why are my people still suffering from things that has happened in the past with my ancestors? And here we are, 2020, and still the same things are happening. We're being beaten, we're being lynched, we're being killed. Why?
I think that justice means bringing us all up as one, as Americans.
I am
George Floyd.
I am
George Floyd.
I am George Floyd.
I am George Floyd.
I am
George Floyd.
I am George Floyd.
I am George Floyd. I won't be able to see my daughter grow old, to be at her prom, to be at her wedding. Justice to me is police reform throughout the whole 50 states, where officers are given random drug tests, random lie detectors, just to see where they're at mentally. This can't happen in 2020. Police brutality must come to an end.